did his homework taking me all the way back to Texas. So I want to frame a little bit what I've brought, because I kind of brought a potpourri of Strive, and really want to be responsive. I think many people here have read some of the articles and information about Strive, and so I wanted to be able to be really flexible. So I have like 50 slides, and I hope we look at 5, but you know. But please, I don't want this to be me presenting for 45 minutes and then questions at the end, so kind of help guide me into what would be most interesting. The only sort of addition I would provide to the wonderful introduction that Lance gave is, when I was in the mayor's office, the way I found Jeff is actually I sat in this conference a year ago at Stanford, because I came in actually as the deputy director of Communities of Opportunity, but in that role became the director of interagency planning for the mayor's office, because of a recognition of how many complex and interagency issues the city was facing and how to coordinate those. And while I was in that role, the Gates Foundation came to San Francisco and gave us a sizable grant to plan and implement an education-related secondary to post-secondary. We didn't go all the way back to cradle to career. So I ran that for 2 years, came to hear Jeff talk to say, how do we bring it all the way back to the cradle part of the continuum? And he said, well, the way to do that is to come join Strive, so I did. So I'm the Director of Knowledge and Innovation for the Strive National Network, and I do directly support a bunch of our sites, but it's also my role to synthesize all of our knowledge and keep this as a, we were just talking about it, as an open source knowledge platform, where what we're learning from all of the individual communities gets fed back to the whole. So Lance did a lot on the background of Strive. I pulled some slides to sort of walk through where we started. I may just do like the 3-minute version of this, just in case there's a little level setting, but I won't go into details. So Strive started in Cincinnati about 7 years ago with the Chancellor of the University of Cincinnati, Nancy Zimfer, looking at college access. It started as a college access initiative and saying, why don't we have more of our young people coming into college and making it through, her institution in particular. And when they started to unpack that, and she brought knowledge works to the table, she was talking to community leaders, business leaders, and the like, quickly people started to go back. Well, you can't start with college access unless you understand what's happening when they're in 9th grade. Did they have their algebra in 8th grade? Were they reading in 3rd grade? Did they come into kindergarten ready? You know, did they have good early childhood experiences? And it kind of led to them saying that it really has to be everything. So they went to a bar, is the famous story. This is a recreation. It is not the actual napkin. But they actually drew out this roadmap of what are the key points that happen to a young person from cradle to career to get there. The napkin turned into a roadmap that the University of Cincinnati did some additional research on to really think about it. In the light blue are some of the key transition points. Okay. So while there are,
I'll just mention you all have that in the very back of your packet.
Okay.
If you want to look at it. How nice.
Excellent. So while I obviously won't walk through all of these, what we started to focus on is, while there are key indicators and key benchmarks kind of at every step, there are some that are more equal than others, if you will, that are indicators for more than just the thing that they are measuring. And those are some of these key transition points. So the Strive National group has really started to focus on kindergarten readiness. And obviously the things that come before in this roadmap influence that, but that is one of the key indicators we're looking at. 3rd or 4th grade reading, every state tracks that differently and sort of hits that benchmark differently. But that's when you transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And so that's a key point to say, are young people reading then? Algebra in 8th grade, another huge transition point in terms of your ability to do the higher order kind of math, science, and the like when you get into high school, graduating high school, entering post-secondary, and then completing. So those are the ones you'll hear us talk about nationally, the ones that we encourage our communities to look at. But depending on the community, people are picking different indicators all along this, and there's a process that they do with us for that. We always get the question, does this really work? How do we understand that? Well, we track 34 different indicators in Cincinnati. That's across, it's really, I think, 11 that are tracked across the 3 geographies that come together in greater Cincinnati, which is Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport, so northern Kentucky. It's a 2-state, 3-city region. And of those 34, 68% were trending up 3 years ago, about 3 years into the partnership, and the most recent data has 81%, all heading in the right direction. So I think this slide is very powerful to think about where you can get to, but it's also a reminder that it takes time. People read the article and they say, we want to do that. It's like, we saw this collective impact thing, we want to do that, and all these indicators are going in the right direction, and how awesome is that? Well, it has taken a lot of time for this to happen in Cincinnati, and we talk about the national work as us trying to help people move through the steps more quickly, but you cannot skip the steps. And so that's another thing as we talk about what it takes to do this work that you'll hear as a theme in my comments. When you unpack some of those individual indicators, actually the early childhood number has gone up even more. It started at about 42% coming in ready, and I think they're at 57% now through some of the partnerships that the United Way has led. We saw some huge bumps in college access, but probably most appropriate to this table is the public-private partnership that we've been able to leverage in Cincinnati. This comes in many forms. It comes in the form of some of the providers using their existing resources differently to do different practices in order to move the needle forward. It comes in some joint fundraising that has happened, and it also comes in the form of funders shifting the way they fund, which is, I know, one of the topics that we want to talk about today. So this is my D-Day slide. I was just in North Carolina with the Lumina and Gates Foundations and a set of grantees that they have, and I think this, if I only had this slide and we stopped, would probably be what to me is the best way to describe collective impact. Typically where communities start is at the bottom. Individual accountability. Data is being collected by organizations, they're understanding the impact they're having individually with a student, and they can understand that and communicate that, but they're not heading in the same direction. They're pulling in different ways. You're getting different things happening with the young people, and it's not aligned. So while people are individually accountable, they're not coming together around a grander purpose. Most collaborations move to the level of alignment. That is typically where you see a lot of collaboration that's come to. So this is where now you all say, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and let's kind of swim in the same direction. There's some common goals. You kind of see people saying, well, we're all going to aim for 3rd grade reading. Let's all see what that looks like. But still kind of individually doing their own thing in that broader picture. What Strive really strives for, is why our name is used, is to get to the level of synergy. And here it's not just that we're all aiming in the same direction, it's that we understand how we fit together to do that. An example that I'll give as we walk through this is what happened with the College Access Network in Cincinnati. So when Strive started, there were, I think, 8 or 10 college access organizations working in the high schools trying to help kids get connected with financial aid and enrollment support and all kinds of things to move them into the college experience. They were not talking to each other. They were not coordinated in any higher level way, but they individually were having outcomes for some of the students that they were serving. The first step that they took was to actually move towards alignment. They said, well, if we sit down together, who is serving which of our students? How do we at least say all of our students need some level of service here? So they actually mapped their services and said, it turns out there's 6 of us at one high school, none at another high school. Let's just move some of those services so that the students who weren't receiving any help are getting it. And at one high school, that was a 40% bump in college enrollment just from doing that. But as you can imagine, that's a one-time gain, right? You moved the service, you've gotten that level to change, but you don't get to the full target of where you're headed. So when we talk about collective impact, it's taking it to the next level, and really this group with their 6 Sigma GE coach, which I'll talk more about, and the reason I was late this morning is I was training a bunch of 6 Sigma coaches in Milwaukee to launch their networks next week, so it's very exciting. But what they did with the data is say, it's not just where are we serving and how do we kind of align what we're doing, but what are the things that our young people actually need? What works? And when they unpacked it, there were 5 different services or sort of access points that that if a student had all 5, they were 90% likely to enroll in college. Things you'd expect: FAFSA enrollment, application support, college tours, and the like. But what they didn't do is say, now all of us have to do all 5. Because what synergy is about is saying, I'm really good at these 2, you're really good at those 3, how do we pair up and do those together? Some organizations did do all 5. Some were started with 4 and they added a 5th, and depending on it. But synergy is really trying to understand it at a different level. And not asking everyone to do the same thing, but to focus on what they're really good at in the bigger picture. So if I leave you with nothing else, that to us is the heart of what collective impact is about. It is not a silver bullet answer where now everyone does the same thing. We're not using the data to analyze it, until you can just keep sifting until the perfect program or set of programs comes out. That it is really about how we use the data to improve our work, not to prove one thing is right and another thing is wrong, and that it never ends. It is really a cycle of continuous improvement.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I'm a little bit curious about the effective, evidence, and efficient, your checked boxes there, and why in accountability evidence, even though you're collecting data, would not be checked.
That is a good question. So in accountability, I think the way and I never use those boxes when I talk about this slide.
Well, you know what?
And now you know why.
No.
So I mean,
if it's not critical, just move.
I don't think it's critical. I mean, I think in general, as the continuum goes, what you're able to say from the data is an individual organization is effective. Kind of on its own, that's what the data is telling you. As you move up, you can actually see the evidence of how they work together, and then the efficiency is the process I just described. That is going to be my on-the-fly interpretation of the checkboxes.
Good improvisation.
Yes.
I don't know if you went over this already, but how were the organizations identified to be part of the program, and how did you kind of achieve buy-in and sort of cooperation so you didn't have turf wars and
That is a great question. One major lesson learned is in Cincinnati, they started by trying to certify people, and that was not a good idea. They started to try to certify providers as Strive providers, like there was a process of kind of anointing, if you will. Yeah, and what we found is that you don't want your table to be defining who's in and who's out in that way. It really kind of sets you in a power dynamic that is not productive with the organizations. And so what we've really shifted to is how do you have groups opt in, not get analyzed out. And so in the opt-in process, there's multiple ways it happens. The 3 most common ways that we are seeing is, so what's happening in Milwaukee is they did not have any existing networks around 3rd grade reading, which is their first issue area they're going to tackle. So they put out an open call, an invitation to engage. Any organization who wanted to come to the table could. I was there last week for the information sessions, and next week the networks are actually kicking off. And it was a completely open process. What we find is when that happens, then the group is going to get together. They're going to start to look at their data. They're going to focus on what are the things they want to work on, and some people will leave. But they will leave because they have chosen to leave, not because the table said, we're not working on what you want to work on. They will have been part of that decision-making process. What happened in Portland, which is a little bit different, was that there were some existing networks. That were already up and running, and we hear this a lot too. It's like, are you trying to be the Borg? I never know if this analogy goes over well. Not today. But in Star Trek, there's this thing called the Borg, and they go around and they make everyone assimilate and have to, and then they're going to collect all of this. And there's some really good partnerships that are already existing, and how do they preserve some of that identity? You don't need to assimilate everyone and have it all be branded as Strive, and now that's it. So what they did in Portland was a request for support, and they reached out to those networks and asked them to say, if you're interested in working with us in this way, using the data in this kind of way, having this sort of coaching and facilitation and going through a continuous improvement process to enhance the work you're doing, apply for this kind of support from us. So it was a very different way of engaging because they wanted to sort of honor what was already there. There are other communities where they're somewhere in the middle, where I would say this is more true in Treasure Valley, where there was a set of organizations that they identified as needing to be the lead organizations. And then they're kind of doing a hybrid of reaching out to them and really having them engage, but then setting a broader table that people can come to over time. So it'll depend a bit on the landscape that you have, but I think it was an important lesson for Strive to think about how you work with the existing sort of collaboratives that are there and make it a positive transition rather than this sense, again, that this is the flavor of the month, collective impact got written, and now, it's going to be a whole new set of partnerships, and what does that mean? So a long answer.
There's actually one other evolution here that's very interesting, because I remember talking to Jeff a year ago, and he would say, well, in Cincinnati, every nonprofit that was in this continuum, right, of cradle to career, really had to be local, had to be all kind of bottoms up based in the community. And what's happened is the report cards that have come out is some of those people, either there wasn't the solution there to begin with, or the solution wasn't good enough. So instead of the local solution, there's more of a momentum to the best solution, and there's more openness to bringing in organizations to fill critical gaps.
Yeah, we've talked, that's a good point in terms of the evolution, is the messaging when we go in is you do want to find what is working locally and shine a light on that and build from it and root it where you are. But now when we talk to networks as they get going about the approach, we talk about using the data to triangulate. You start with what does the local data say about what's working. You triangulate that against the lived experience of the practitioners in the room and really kind of honoring that knowledge with then the national research about what is working elsewhere. Because you might not have tried the best thing, and somebody else might have. But what we find is if networks sort of come to it themselves that way, rather than somebody coming in and saying, we know we have the Silver Bullet program that we're going to bring, then it's this much more receptive way of getting them on board. Because they've come to the conclusion that they need it, rather than going to a What Works clearinghouse and being told that this is what works, what you're doing doesn't work, and we're bringing it in. So it creates, the authentic demand, if you will, for some of the practices to come in from elsewhere. Okay, so that's my what is collective impact. Although I have a really fun and hard to read chart that I may or may not try out on you all in a little bit. But I want to sort of shift now to the Strive 4 pillars and how we think about the work. And all of you have this as a handout. I have a whole lot of slides to take you through what is a couple pages of our rubric. I'm not going to walk through it in painstaking detail, but again, ask you to let me know which are the areas you're most interested in. But in general, when Strive tried to start doing the national replication, which preceded the collective impact article, but since the collective impact article, over 120 communities representing, I think, pretty much every state in the country and 3 international sites have approached us to say, how do we do this? And it was a big shift for our organization to go from, on the ground running an organization, a partnership, to trying to explain how others would do it. So we've distilled the 4 pillars from our work and some of the key components of them, and then we just recently released a progress assessment tool to kind of say what are the stages of development within each of these. So the 4 pillars that come together in our framework are first the shared community vision. How do you get the cross-sector stakeholders to buy in and want to do this work? How are they accountable to each other? What are the relationships and the structure, the decision-making, the teams that are formed, and how do they work with each other? And then how do you communicate this? Because it is extremely complicated to talk not only externally about what you're doing, but talk to each other. When you have groups working from early childhood all the way to college completion, they speak different languages, and when you bring the business community in with the sort of more bureaucratic K-12 structure, and when you add in the philanthropic sector, there's just a lot of communication and translation that needs to happen. And so that's kind of getting that shared vision incorporates all of those components. The next is the evidence-based decision-making. And here what we encourage people to start is to pick those outcomes. The only way to do the evidence-based decision-making is to decide what you're aiming for, and then use the data to understand what's working and not working in that context. This was another big lesson in Cincinnati when they first launched. They launched with groups that were around strategies. We're going to have a mentoring group. We're going to have an arts group. We're going to have a tutoring group. And what they found is you can kind of get to alignment. You get a lot of best practice sharing when that happens. But synergy is very difficult because you don't know what you're aiming for. And so it's like, well, we're tutoring, but that's great. And now how do we understand, is the needle for our community really moving? So selecting the community level outcomes is kind of the start of that process. And then we also encourage communities not to start on all of them at once. That was another lesson from Cincinnati. They started with like 20 some odd networks, and it drove them crazy, and it was really, really hard to manage. So we suggest people pick 1 to 3 for their first year out of the gate. It depends on your capacity, the resources you have to bring to the bear, what might already exist. But to really think about, are there some places you want to start this work? And then building the comprehensive data management system that enables you to connect all these pieces together. So when we talk about evidence-based decision-making, it's as much picking what you're aiming for as it is about then the data and analysis that will help you understand your progress. The next pillar is the networks themselves. So the collaborative action is how do you get groups of practitioners to come together and talk about this and look at the data together and understand it. As you have heard and I've already mentioned, Strive uses Six Sigma, which is a GE continuous improvement approach, but there are many. Baldrige and results-based accountability and others. There's no magic to Six Sigma being the process. It's really more that there is a rigorous approach to the cycle of inquiry that these networks are going to take on. And we encourage communities to look around and say, in Kalamazoo, it's actually their hospital uses Baldrige, and they're going to use some of their Baldrige coaches to help facilitate some of these networks. So to kind of think about, this is a great ask to your business community. It's an expertise that many of them have that most nonprofits don't. And so finding what you have and starting from there. And in some communities, we're bringing together people who, some are Baldrige, some are Six Sigma, some are the other, because you kind of can distill the key elements that are a lot of similar across those to use. So figuring out which approach you want to use, and then working with the networks to actually develop plans on how they're going to scale what they identify works. And sometimes scaling is bringing in new resources, new organizations. Sometimes it's shifting practices across groups doing something similar. But that's kind of what you're aiming for, is the plan to act. And then lastly, the investment in sustainability. How does this continue? And for us, it starts with the community engagement piece. There will always be transitions in the leadership. Superintendents come and go. Nancy Zimfer left and went to SUNY. Mayors come and go. And the way this kind of sustained work sustains is that the community sort of believes in it, feels the power of it, and holds the feet to the fire of the new players who come to the table to engage in it. So that is, our first way of thinking about sustainability. But then the others have to be the investment side. That the funding for the collaborative work itself. So as the networks develop these plans, where does the funding come from? Again, sometimes that is the existing funding being redirected to new activities that are shown to have greater efficacy or to be connected in a better way. But sometimes it is new funding that comes into play. And then the support for the anchor. In every community where we do this work, you have to have someone who wakes up every day thinking about nothing but how do I keep that cats moving in the same direction. We call it the cat herder. Or the project manager is what I did for the mayor in San Francisco. It's what Jeff did in Cincinnati. But that there's like a core set of anchor glue functions that have to happen, that collaboration doesn't happen on its own. And that funding for that is hard to come by. It's often thought of as overhead and infrastructure and not direct programmatic outcomes for kids. But that goes back to the strategic communications of how do we explain what it is we're doing and why this is important. So what I am not going to do is go through every single one of these. So what we did release is a rubric that says for each individual element I just talked about, what does early stage of development look like? What does an intermediate stage of development look like? And then what are the milestones we are looking for communities to hit to say that they've really built this kind of infrastructure. And we're going to do a lot of national advocacy around communities who make these milestones. So we are looking for 25 communities to take this journey with us and have all of the dark orange data. But rather than walk through all of this, I would love to pause and say, are there certain elements as I walk through the overall framework that were of particular interest, and maybe we could dive into one or two rather than all 12.
So in the shared community vision, do you have cities you've worked in that are akin to kind of the profile of the valley, which is a very transient kind of place? The civic infrastructure here, I think, is really different than places like Cincinnati. And even though there's a lot of wealth, there's also people coming in and out, not a lot of sustained leadership. Do you have any lessons in terms of communities like this? And I mean, some of the national indicators show that San Jose is in a league of its own in this way, being very culturally disconnected. So I doubt you have an exact example, but do you have anything that comes close in some of the accommodations or adaptations that have had to be made?
I'm trying to think of what would be the closest analogy of the communities that I'm working in. I mean, the transient nature is something that is not surprising. And you see that in different forms because leadership is always changing. I mean, even in Cincinnati, there's been 3 or 4 superintendents since the
No,
start.
what I mean is the transient population,
The
Okay.
students themselves.
the families,
The
and
families
the
coming in.
citizens, and then also 31 school districts, and on and on and on and on.
Yeah, so I think the valley. I mean, this is one thing that'd be interesting to encourage you all to think about: is what is the geography you want to cover, and it may not be the entire valley. It may be thinking about what they're doing in Santa Barbara. Is they're looking countywide, and the county is huge for Santa Barbara, but they are focusing on 5 communities within it. So they're building kind of mini infrastructure. Houston is doing the same thing. Where there's some regional councils. So there is an overall coordinating body that tries to have some consistency, do some group fundraising, and in particular engage the business community for the region because it doesn't make sense for Santa Maria to try to engage the entire Santa Barbara business community. So there's a kind of a hub and spoke model that we're seeing evolve in some communities. And when you get to the level of it's 10 school districts in Treasure Valley, which is Boise. 31 is a lot. And I would think about how you break that down. So I think the hub and spoke nature is
great.
probably the closest analog. I think in terms of the population being transient, I don't have a good analog right now. I'm sure there are communities that are like that, but just of the ones that I am currently working with Detroit, Milwaukee, Denver, Santa Barbara, Boise, Portland, Houston, and the East Bay. And I don't think any of them fit. So I'd have to ask my colleagues about some of those. Sure.
And Kimberly, can you go into a little more detail about those particular places? Help us understand the where a little bit more granularly. Because in some cases we've seen, the where we're going to focus on one school district. Okay, in some places like Cincinnati, it's actually 3 big school districts. So how do these different cities put some more color on the where?
Sure. The where is often a tough question. How broad do you want to set your table? And in Houston, they said it is Houston, and that is 1 million kids in the system, not 1 million people living in Houston, but 1 million kids. And so they felt like there was an imperative at the community level to sort of galvanize around this. The University of Houston is the lead anchor for this work there. But then they did have to break it down. In Milwaukee, they're having the other struggle. They're saying it's the city of Milwaukee, and people are asking why isn't it Greater Milwaukee? And how do you understand that? And they're saying this is a lot of the decisions tend to ride on what is the sphere of influence of those who are setting the partnership table. Where are we really going to be able to get movement? And in Milwaukee, it'll start there and probably move out. And in Houston, they were like, it really has to be everyone because if you're talking about the business community that we're engaging, a huge ISD system that has some regional councils and the University of Houston serving them all, that was part of the decision. Detroit is a completely just different beast. I don't know how many people have been to Detroit lately. but their struggles are, I don't think they're analogous to almost anywhere else that I've been. I mean, they have these huge vacancy rates. 72,000 was the number I heard, just completely empty homes that are plopped in the middle of neighborhoods. You know, it's not like they're regions that are moved. So their discussions about where are kind of about how do we bring all of this together, you know, in a community that is like has such an eroded fabric. And so that's been more their struggle. I think Santa Barbara probably has some of the more interesting lessons for this group because it's a foundation-led initiative. It's here in California. And they really felt strongly that they're where, that everything always happens just in Santa Barbara City. You know, that's where most of the wealth is. That's where a lot of the foundations are sort of concentrated, but that the county really needed to come together differently, and that it was really a push strategy on their part to say this needs to be bigger than just Santa Barbara itself, the Santa Barbara city itself. They struggled a lot because their different foundations have different geographic scopes written into their missions. And so how you reconcile that when disproportionate resources are available to different communities even within their overall partnership has been a bit of a struggle. But when we talk about sort of the funding alignment and funding decisions, maybe I can get more into that. And I think somebody's getting me so much. Sorry.
That's good.
I'm doing my best. Yes.
Is there any, what's the importance of, I know for instance San Francisco is the city and the county, which has a lot of implications
Thank you so
for
much.
these
That's right,
larger
I got it.
systems changes. So I guess the question is twofold. Are you working in city areas where it's just as common to have a city and county be separate? And
I
then
mean, most
second-
places it's separate.
So most places you're working are separate. And then what is the role of the non-education focused community on achieving these broader community level impacts?
That's a good question. So just in terms of the first bit, it is actually more rare for a city and county to be a combined entity. So in most places we're working, it's multi-county or multi-city, and in Cincinnati it's 2 states, couple of county, you know. So that is on that. I think in terms of the role that different partners play in this, there are multiple. So what we try to push people to go beyond is the typical roles you'd expect, and I'll start with business on this. Traditionally, what people ask for when they approach the business community is funding and internships, and ideally paid internships, right? And it's kind of, that's the sort of, this is how you can engage in education. What we really try to reframe it around is what are the unique skills that the business community has that can be deployed to move the needle. And that was the aha with the Six Sigma coaches, is that the business community had people who could do data analysis in a way that was very, not often accessible to people in the social sector, had facilitation skills. I mean, bringing the cats together and trying to have them all, you know, have these conversations. We're talking about having 3 different facilitators for one of the networks in Milwaukee because we know it's going to be politically charged because of some of the space that they're in. It's the biggest choice and charter city in the country, but I think in terms of percentage of students being served in outside of the traditional public school. And so just the facilitation skills. The other thing we often talk about with the business community is the communication, the branding, the messaging. How do you make this succinct and get it down to something that people can understand? These are all expertise that the business community often brings. You still want the internships and you still want the funding. But when you engage in the skill level of how people can actually help move the needle in a more tangible way, the other 2 often follow. Because then there's an ownership a shared ownership of the problem. It's the same thing when you think about the foundations. You know, you start with the money question. But how do you recognize that foundations have a lot of expertise in understanding nationally what is happening? What are some of the other practices? What are some of the resources we could bring to bear that look differently than programmatic funding to move the needle? On the civic, it's usually the call to action. I mean, in Portland, the mayor stood up and said, we need to do this. And he has been the huge champion. It's the same in Denver and in San Francisco as well. And so kind of thinking about who's owning the message and how it's getting communicated, and changing the dialogue from how the civic leaders try to take over education to how do they partner with education. Has been really meaningful in this. And even with the nonprofits themselves, it's a different dialogue than saying, what is your program, and are we going to fund it or are we not going to fund it, and how do they talk to each other where they're usually competing for funding. In most places, what we've seen is when they can come together, since there are many funders in the room, I'm sure what you see is everybody who works in XYZ space, call it college access, quotes the exact same statistics in their grant application. In our community, this many of the kids don't go on. But when they can say, and collectively, this is how many we're serving, and collectively we know what the gap is, and we would like you to fund the 5 of us together to do it differently, it changes the dialogue. And so talking to the nonprofits differently about it. So, to me, it's that every player is moving a little bit out of their comfort zone, but hopefully deeper in the level of engagement about what they can bring to the partnership. In the back, and then.
I'm particularly interested in what you said last, in that I think in Silicon Valley, in my opinion, there's a lot of duplication of efforts where everyone's trying to serve the community the best way they can, but there's duplicative organizations. And did you find when you got these nonprofits together, they did cooperate, as you said, but did some actually merge? Was there elimination of some of the service organizations? How did that work?
So this is one that I know that I might be podcasted here, so I want to be careful in the language. So the answer is kind of yes, but I think it's really, this is the biggest fear that we get from the nonprofits when we come in and talk about this approach, is that you're going to use the data to analyze us out. What has happened over time that we see most commonly is a lot of scope creep that happens with a nonprofit is because they see the 6 other problems the student that they are working with is facing, and they don't know how else to connect it, so they try to take it on themselves. And when they come together and they see, you're doing really great enrichment work, and I really know how to do tutoring, and if we can pair up so the kid is excited to come and stay, and I'm delivering the academic content, I can stop trying to figure out how to do art class, right? So we do often see some level of that happening, where organizations go back to the core of what they're good at, and work together differently. There are sometimes mergers that occur. That hasn't been a huge trend yet, but I think it could happen over time. And over time, what did happen was, and again, it has to be careful about the language here, but organizations who just did not want to do this left the table. And the more funders were aligned around this work, sometimes that impacted their funding. But you have to be really careful when you're setting the table that is not what the aim is. That you want them to come through this process and make these decisions with you, and not that is probably the biggest fear. That's why I'm really careful in how to talk about it, because while it's probably going to be some of the outcomes, if that's the outcome you're aiming for, you're actually not gonna get there either. So I hope that was.
Yes. What has been the role of the teachers' unions at the table and in all these some of these various places?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're going in May to a conference where it's all school districts, 10 or 12 school districts who want to do work like this, and we're bringing the head of the teachers union from Cincinnati.
In one place, 10 or 12 teachers.
School districts.
In one place.
Yeah, it's a foundation. It convenes them. It's the Panasonic Foundation, and they invest in 10 or 12 school districts.
But I mean, in one geographical
area?
No, they're just school districts interested in change. Okay.
It's like San Diego and and Oakland and Columbus. I can't remember the list, but but the reason I was saying that is it's an audience of all school districts who are bringing union leaders and school board leaders and superintendents, and we're bringing the head of the union from Cincinnati, and the current local partnership lead in Cincinnati said to me, if you leave them out because you're worried they will become a problem, it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that depending on the relationship, you may or may not start there. But that they have really worked with the union to say, let's look at this data together, let's talk about what change can look like together and understand it in a different context. That might not happen as easily in every location, and it wasn't easy in Cincinnati. It definitely took time to cultivate, but they were very, very intentional about involving them because it will flip on you the other way if you don't often. And it'll depend a little bit on what you decide to take on. In a lot of our communities, the first thing they go for is not usually the teacher sort of preparation and quality issues. You start with aligning the out-of-school enrichment with the in-school enrichment time, and you want to get some wins under your belt before you might want to take on some of those issues, and then that gives you a different dialogue with the teachers union. Here's some credibility. Here's how how the work we're doing is already helping you in the classroom, and let's come to the conversation that way. So I don't know if I would start there, but we have seen productive engagement with the unions in several communities.
So that's one of the groups of CATs, right? Can you go through the other major subgroupings of CATs? I mean, we've heard nonprofits, I think business groups, school
Yes.
districts, charter schools are there. Could you go through those? And then the other thing that I heard you say a couple of times was universities as being the anchor entity, and I'm wondering whether that's because they have a particular credibility in being the honest broker for all these groups, or have there been other entities besides universities that become the anchor?
Yes. So let me do the cats, and then let me get to the anchor, and I have some slides. So from my potpourri of what will we pick and choose from on the anchor stuff. But we talk about having at least 5 sectors represented. Education being one, but within education that breaks down into your early childhood, your K-12, and your higher ed, and those are very, very different systems. There is no system in early childhood. Then K-12 it tends to be these established bureaucracies, and then higher ed is you have your community colleges, your 4-year colleges, your for-profit vocational tech. So that's also a different kind of group. But so education is one of our sectors, but it's the most complex. We talk about the business community, civic, which is mayors, but also county, staff in San Francisco. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families was highly involved. The nonprofit sector and philanthropy. There's one more. There's philanthropy. And then the 6th, we don't call it a sector, but the undergirding of all of this is the community. So when you think about community engagement, we sort of infuse it throughout. It's a harder one to say it's a sector, that kind of comes and sits at the table with a representative in that way. So we talk a lot about how do you engage in community dialogue around this work and have the work be informed by and beneficial to the community. But let me go to, I'm just going to be faster to do it this way, to the questions about the anchor or the backbone. So these are, I have a device. These are the criteria that we suggest when you're evaluating what a backbone can be, and it is not always universities. And actually, I think one of our lessons is to potentially caution about that.
What else has it been?
So what it has been, so this is actually from our friends at FSG in the second collective impact article. I would say for Strive, so these are some of the pros and cons of different potential anchors. I think they did a really nice job capturing this from FSG in that article. But so it's there are funder-based ones, and here you'll see it's beyond education because they were looking beyond education. Sometimes a new nonprofit gets created or an existing nonprofit takes on the role. The challenge with that often is people view the nonprofit as pushing its own agenda or programs. But sometimes, if you look at the Harlem Children's Zone, sometimes by having the right programs, that gives them the credibility. So it can cut both ways. All of these can cut both ways. Government as an anchor, again, I think our big lesson on government as an anchor is that it is a great place to catalyze it. It is often not a good long-term home. But the ability of a mayor to convene a table like this is really, really unbelievable. But what they did in Portland is start there and then move it into a nonprofit which they actually merged 3 different nonprofits into one to become the home for it in Portland.
And what were the groups?
Yeah, what were they?
It was the Portland Schools Foundation, another school-based. There were 3 separate fundraising and grant-making entities that were working to support education, and they were going to be fighting over who it was going to be if they didn't merge. And the mayor actually kind of used some of his political capital. He dissolved. There had been a long-standing sort of education business roundtable that the mayor convened, and he dissolved that and made them the board of the new entity. So he really pushed that to happen. I think what we're seeing most commonly in Strive, so this is a little bit broader, we're seeing United Ways, we're seeing community foundations, and if you think about it, those 2 are for the same reason, right? That they have an ability to do some fundraising, they are very community rooted, they often are working with a lot of the players that you'd want to bring together, like the universities was the first wave of replication, the first before the article came out, actually, was Living Cities had funded Strive to expand for new communities. They were all university-based because the sort of the genesis of Strive was Nancy Zimfer, who was the president of the University of Cincinnati, but also the president of the Association of Public and Land Trust Universities. And I think what was very clear is that, like a mayor, that is a great call to action. Like government, it is a tough place to live because of the bureaucracy and it's not as nimble in responding. And so I think in Houston they're either in the process or have finished transitioning it out. So there's the president and chancellor of the U of H system is still a co-chair at the table. But I think for both government and for universities, the challenge of working within that system is a little bit tough. Yeah.
So how does the Strive nonprofit organization in like your role work with these various backbones, or where would you fit on this chart?
Technical assistance.
Okay.
So we have. I mean, a huge part of my job is to develop sort of curriculum and knowledge to share. So as somebody's trying to make this decision, here's the 5 things you need to think about. How do we figure out which are the organizations that are even. Sometimes this starts because an anchor steps up. And they say, we want to anchor this, help us get the table together. In Detroit, it was a group of people who said, we want to do this, where should it be anchored? And so we're kind of helping facilitate that conversation with them. But we have a pretty structured process for folks around each of the pillars to say, how do you get this infrastructure built? Where does it start? What are the lessons that we have? What are the questions you need? Let's look together at what's existing in community. There's 45 communities that are formally part of the Strive network right now. Of those, about 20 are working with us in a strategic assistance relationship, and the other 25 are tapping into the knowledge network without. I'm on the phone every week. It's where I've been on the phone 3 times this week with Milwaukee, kind of directly helping their cat herder manage this process. And then there's other communities who are drawing on our resources but not engaging with us. And either is fine for us. We're trying to build a field. So it sort of depends on what the needs of the community are.
So in Cincinnati, where would you fit on that chart?
So in Cincinnati, Knowledge Works is an operating foundation, and they have the local Cincinnati partnership as one of their 3 projects that they fund. So it's not quite a community foundation, but it looks the most like that of the options. It's rare that you have an operating foundation that kind of can be set up that way, but that's what it mostly looks like. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your experiences around starting up. Specifically, it seems that to bring the right people to the table to come up with some really goals and metrics, and then to bring in funders, it seems like it would be useful to have sort of a smaller planning grant and time period where you can actually put sort of a business plan together and then go out to larger funders, businesses, because they know what you need. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the startup process and how it's worked and what happened?
Yes. Let me unpack that. So I would agree that I think one of our lessons is, since Lance shared that I'm from Texas, the phrase we use in Texas is you don't want your sizzle too far in front of your steak. And one thing we've seen, and this often happens when civic leaders they announce this grand partnership, right? Everybody reads that article and they're like, we want to do this. We're going to have this great partnership. And it takes time to build the networks and the infrastructure and the data to get it done. And that can be uncomfortable in the distance between the two. And so just being thoughtful about that. Most communities, we work with a core group of leadership in Treasure Valley, which is Boise, but I always say Treasure Valley because it's broader than Boise, and they do not like it if you just say Boise because it alienates the people who are not living in Boise. But in Boise, there were 18 core leaders that came together, and we worked with them to sort of talk about what some of these issues are, and then they kind of put some initial thinking in place and convened a huge community meeting with 150 stakeholders and asked for feedback and, so this is the mission that we'd like. Does that resonate with you? Does it not? What's missing? These are the goals that we've started with. We looked around. I really encourage people to do some history mapping in your community because this is not the first time people have come together around these issues.
No, actually there is an existing organization based in San Jose called Kids in Common, which brings together on a monthly basis leaders from all of the social service agencies. They have representatives from the mayor's office. They have a lot of nonprofits there. The business community is only barely there. The Silicon Valley Leadership Forum has a couple reps. And then there are a few funders. Linda Green from Materials is there. I'm there. A couple of individuals are there. But getting these, and they look at Kids Common Good because your thing about scope creep, kids are coming to school hungry or without proper medical care. So, so we've got people from the health trust showing up, and there's always an argument about what's the most important thing to work on. But they've kind of generally focused in more on education, and you have to do it very carefully so that the health people who actually have a fair amount of money don't completely walk away. And they do track what's going on, but getting a broader involvement and getting, the marketing piece, getting all that stuff isn't working that effectively. And the official, the organization that does this is, it's a half-time person. And so that doesn't work real well as a cat herder when you're also doing the research and the analysis as well as everything else. And I'm just wondering how, but this organization's been around for a while, how we could possibly tap into something that's so well established on that piece of the map without stepping on too many toes.
It's a good question. That it is. There's different ways that the early startup happens. Sometimes it's an organization doing a pivot. Since I'm in Silicon Valley, talk about the pivot, where there's an existing purpose and partnership, but they're trying to shift how they do the work. I mean, in Portland, that was when they did the request for support to say, this is a new way of doing it, but your network is going to remain your network, but we're going to support you to do the work in a different way. So I think it's a different conversation about how it starts when it's a new thing. Where there might be a network around different pieces than when it's a big existing thing. I think where to start with that? I think when you have an existing partnership like that, a couple of things to think about. There has to be an honest conversation about, do we feel like we are getting where we want to go? And if not, is this kind of approach something that is going to help us get there, to build from? I mean, because, again, collective impact is not new, but the danger, actually, one of our colleagues at the Promise Neighborhood Institute said, is the danger is people are using new language to talk about old work. And they read that article and they say, this is what we're doing. We have been collectively working towards impact for a long time, right? And I think what we sometimes find is people are not prepared for the deeper rigor around the data and for the time frames it takes to do some of this work. And so they say, we want to collectively have impact like right now. And of course we're going to be data-based, nobody's going to say no to any of the things in that article, right? So it's trying to get the conversation to be a level more granular, to really get people to think about, do we want to come together? Are you willing to put your data on the table to be analyzed in this way, school district? That is a tough conversation. But, if people can believe in what the outcomes are going to be, and the only way they're going to believe in that is that they are willing to take a hard look at what they're doing and say it's not enough. And that's a tough conversation, because you want to honor the good work that is happening. It's not like kids aren't going to college and, and lives change and trajectories change, but it's that the collective impact. The chancellor in Houston actually said it really well. She said, we had to have a really tough meeting where we looked around and everyone, when people fear change, they tend to do two things. They tend to talk about what they're already doing, the what we're doing syndrome, or look for the silver bullet, and because it's not out there, resist change, because they're like, you can't prove to us that this thing is going to be better than what we're doing. And she stood up and said, I hear you all that you're doing this great work, but how is it that we are individually so excellent and collectively so mediocre? And the data is the translator in that. Bringing the data to these conversations inevitably makes the meetings go way better, especially when you have people who are, that roadmap was huge to be able to say, where do we all fit? And it doesn't mean we're working on all of this all the time at once, but it gave a visual of how, and the indicators below the line, if you will, are all the socio-emotional sort of indicators, because they have an impact. But I think the other lesson in all of that is we encourage people to form networks around bodies of work that have an ability to get your arms around. So third grade reading, right? And the third grade reading group has to trust that the early childhood group is going to do the early childhood piece and not try to go back there, because they will.
Yeah.
They absolutely will, right? And that the third grade reading group might have a group that's working on sort of health and socio-emotional, but they're not trying to be that. And then the bigger table is where you have the conversations about how those things come together. So you have to break it down into manageable chunks, but then have that picture where everyone can see where they fit.
Can you be a little more specific about, if your goals are all around education, which the Cincinnati goals seem to be around, or this blue sheet or whatever it is, and then when you're doing health and mental health and food, or housing stability or whatever, I'm having a hard time envisioning quite how all those people come together and who takes on what, and how you use data to do education. Are you using data to filter these other people in? Can you be more specific about how who actually comes to which table when?
It's a good question, and it's a little bit of a tough one, to be candid. So one thing I think Cincinnati has done well, and I think it's in the current report card, which I don't have with me, is in the back there is a bigger map of partnerships working on other related things that are not our things.
Okay.
Health, workforce, so what happens, to the 30-year-old who needs retraining and, has low education. Strive is not going to take that on, but here's who's taking it on, and kind of being able to create a box that makes sense. So that's one thing. And Strive as a national organization, as a local organization, said we just do the education version of this. That it's a strategic decision. If somebody calls and wants to do this in health, we will refer them to FSG, who's doing this much more broadly than we are. But we are just about education. The Foundation Strategy Group. So they wrote the collective impact article. And there's a lot of players who are doing this in different ways, but so we have made a very strategic decision. The other thing, it's like the world's simplest tool that we did. I'll see if I can pull it up. Coaches training. There's just a lot of. It might be helpful to just walk through really quickly kind of how this process looks. And this is the training that we were giving to the coaches in Milwaukee. So what we encourage people to do is what's called a fishbone in the Six Sigma process, but it's a hypothesis tree in my world, since I did not grow up in Six Sigma. But it's to start by saying, if we're aiming for third grade reading, what do we think are the things that have the most influence on it? And so this is the brainstorming phase, right? So we talk about, as the networks come together, sort of three phases. There's the familiarizing. What is this network, collective impact thing? Do I want to do it? Blah, blah, blah. Then there's the kind of brainstorming, and then there's the prioritizing. So this is a tool for the brainstorming. I mean, there's lots of tools. Doesn't need to be a fish. But to actually get people to focus on, what are the things we think matter most? In Milwaukee, they did it for third grade reading, and they said there's stuff that's happening in school, out of school, and at home. And they have 3 networks now that are launching around those 3 things. So that there's some separation that happens.
3 different collective impact networks.
Yes. Just around third grade reading. They haven't even gotten to 8th grade math yet. Some people, it's 1 network around third grade reading, but then inevitably they have to have subcommittees because some of this work has to get split out. So this was their first, this is why we say don't start with every indicator all at once, right? And this is also what I was saying before about understand the depth of what you're taking on. Because to just say we want to do collective impact and not know that it's actually, there's a rigorous process to it that's huge to get there. So what they've done is they've done this like sort of initial scoping. Here's some of the strategies we think matter most about in school, out of school, and at home. They're going to go through a brainstorming process around, but to even get to this, you start with what's already happening that we can build from. In your experience, what's missing? Are you aware, as Lance brought up, what's happening elsewhere that we might want to think about and look at to create this list? And really pushing people to get past programs, because inevitably they want to feel heard. They're worried they're going to get analyzed out. So they're like, well, what should be on our list is big brothers and sisters. That's not a helpful way to analyze data, right? And so you have to push them to say, what do they do that you think matters for third grade reading? And it's like, oh, a caring adult is reading to a child. Because that's something that multiple organizations can do if you understand how to do it well. So that's the first step. Then it's a box. What's in scope and what's out of scope. But getting the network to define their criteria for that. We often talk about your ability to impact it. What's sort of your sphere of influence? What is the political will? What is the cost? Like, let's not take on something we can't do.
On the other hand, let's not take on something that we know wouldn't work if we didn't take it on. For example, if you live in a poor community with kids who aren't being fed, their kindergarten readiness is going to be dramatically affected by whether or not they're fed.
Well, and so what we talk about for folks to do is, so for the team that's together, what is their scope? And then to document what are the things that other networks might be working on. So if this is an issue, we're not going to try to figure out how to feed them, because we are the group that's like the teachers and the university teacher prep people, and we're not going to solve. We don't want them to have their scope creep. So they need to document who else needs to do it. And if it may end up out. This is from Milwaukee, so that's why it says Milwaukee succeeds. But it may end up out of scope, and you have to know who else in the community is working on it, and just say, we're glad the food bank is working on that. It's not going to be what we're doing. Every community has to define their box, and this is it is the simplest tool in the world, right? But getting
good point.
Yeah, it's like it is getting people to define their boundaries is really important. Pushing them around these questions around what is the scope of your control? What are you able to do? If it's something someone else needs to do, how do we document and understand that, but not try to take it all on? This is a hard discussion. It's a simple tool, but a hard discussion. And in the end, you can't do everything. So part of what we encourage networks to say is, well, so maybe the in-school group is going to get to the limit of how well they can prepare their teachers, and it's still going to come back to the food question, and so now they're going to ask another group to start around that. But it's not going to be the same people doing that.
Right. So you're not trying to I thought part of it was trying to coordinate the food people and the school people, but you're saying keep those networks separate.
Well, you define. So if the food people, what we say is, if the way we pick, which is not scientific, what's kind of below the line, is how you can say that impacts the academic indicator. Is that there's a direct line. There's lots of indirect lines between everything, and then it's up to your community to pick what's in your scope and out of your scope for some of those associated factors, and there has to be a boundary to how far away those go. The other thing I'll say though is at those tables when you get all those folks together, you have to be really clear on why people are there, and coming back to how the food is going to impact their grade reading has to be the way it's talked about, because there's a whole set of work around food access and all these other things that is critical to delivering those services, but not part of an education partnership. So that's the other thing about drawing this line carefully. Well, you haven't gotten in yet, and then I'll come back to you.
Can you talk a little bit about, I'm sure as a part of the analysis, there's often pieces identified that either aren't currently existing, or maybe that's the group that was resistant and opted out. Can you talk a little bit about how you either recreated a similar function or recruited different people to start organizations? Is there some funding through the network that allows some of those pieces to be filled in?
So I don't know of anywhere yet that people have said this isn't happening, let's create a new organization. What may happen is that existing organizations start doing different work because they've identified something, or they may recruit organizations to come in, but that's when you get the authentic demand for the reading partners to come in, rather than reading partners saying, here we are, we're going to do this work, because the group has now identified it as a gap and recognized that they're not doing it. And that is, I think, the best way to onboard a new sort of organization or activity into a community, so that you don't get the typical then, well, why are they getting the money and we're not getting the money and we're now all fighting for the same funders, right? It just changes the dialogue pretty substantially. So we are seeing that happen. We are seeing national organizations be brought in and some organizations shifting. I haven't yet seen a new organization.
And what about the opposite example where you have someone that's completely opted in but isn't particularly effective? How have the networks handle that? Do you let the data speak for itself and let the table essentially rally, or?
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts on that. First, I think one thing they did really well in Milwaukee is build it, and this was a little bit of the funding piece that I was going to talk about too, so let me go back to my other. But how you invest in this work. So what we want to encourage people to say is we often the data will say one thing. It'll tell you a one-dimensional answer to how well an organization is doing. It's not moving the needle on their grade reading, but maybe they have really authentic relationships with the kids that they're serving. You want to capitalize on that. What they did in Cincinnati was buddy up organizations. So an organization that was underperforming got paired with an organization that was performing well, and they did some capacity building together. So what we try to talk about when we go into communities is a commitment. What we're asking people who join the table is a commitment to change, if change is needed. But the reason we created the Local Impact Fund and Technical Assistance, the LIFT, is that sometimes support is needed for that. There's something different than the core programmatic funding that can be really, really supportive in this. And in San Francisco, the Gates money, we used it, we needed to do some totally different professional development, so we used it for release time for the teachers. There's that kind of funding that is hard to come by sometimes, but can really, really be catalytic in this work. But there will be people who just leave. I don't want to sugarcoat it in that there's going to be some organizations that don't want to change, they're not convinced by the process, and that's okay. They're opting in or opting out, but if they're making that decision, so if we really do want to find ways to help them change if they want to change. But some of them are going to leave, some of them won't lose funding because of that, because not all funders are aligned around this, even in any individual community. And that's just going to be that just is in this work. But I think what we have found though is more more often than not, organizations stay with it. They do want to change. Small investments in capacity building, whether it's professional development, a tool that needs to be built to kind of support them collecting the data in a different way and the like, can make a big difference. And I think these slides are in your in your packet. So, yes.
I'm intrigued by your defining the scope. And that is, let's say that you have defined your scope, but the next level up is screwing up. How do you keep focus here when because it's just there is a symbiosis between you, and I need your help.
When you're building your partnership table, you need the next level up to be added. I mean, that's the first starting point. The superintendent, the chancellors of the universities, the mayor are at the table to do this. We talk about, there's a great article that I think Casey sponsored about having an authorizing body. Because what we do see,
mastery.
Yeah, it's not, because the chancellor of the community college in San Francisco had to tell his staff that he was on board, and if changes needed to come from this, that he was committed to those. And there's a great example of that in San Francisco where the data showed that incoming freshmen, if you will, to the community college were not getting any of the classes they needed because the registration priority had them last. Then they weren't staying. Yeah. And he changed the registration priority. The data was compelling. People had been complaining about it for years, but they didn't have the data to make the case. And he made that happen. The other way this goes, though, again, I have to be careful. I think I'm being recorded. Is sometimes it's the higher up that's the problem, but then at that table, what happens? So the positive part of this that I was going to say is, then the superintendent was like, "Oh man, he did that. I better step up, right?" Yeah. And then the superintendent opened all the high schools to do the college placement test on site at the high schools, so that more kids would have access to it. So there was a real, they hold each other's feet to the fire. So even if one, and they were both high performing. I want to make sure I say that in San Francisco because they were such good partners in this work. But that's not always the case. But if you have that high level table right, they will hold each other accountable. So that's one piece. And then the other thing that sometimes happens is sometimes it's the middle people who don't want to change, right? And that authorizing body has to say, we're going to do things differently, and I need you to do things differently. And we had two department heads where one was really engaged and on board, and one who wasn't. And the chancellor just had to say to one of them, "We're doing this." So this is why the cat herder is such a difficult role. Is there's always somebody bouncing out. There just always is going to be somebody doing that. But the other thing is that me in that role and Jeff in his role in Cincinnati before we did the national work, everyone knew we had the authority from that authorizing body. And I sometimes had to go and just have the one-on-one conversations with people about where is this headed, and then sometimes I had to call the superintendent and say so-and-so isn't showing up for the fourth time. So the interrelationship between the network and the partnership table is really critical, because we have found a couple of communities where people they have a network, they're doing it, and then they just hit this they hit this wall because they don't have buy-in or authority at the highest level. And that is one of the best things this article does for you. Take the article to the superintendent, because no one says no to the article. Of course they want to have collective impact, and then they're in. and then you all can hold their feet to the fire too in doing it. It's a really good role that business and philanthropy can play, is to get the key education and civic leaders engaged.
So following up on that, what do you do about a school district that says, "Thanks you guys, I love the article, we got this. We got this covered, we're going to do this, internally with our resources. We're going to Six Sigma, we got it, thanks. Give us the money."
Yeah, right.
Why don't they have it, and how do you work with that if,
Yeah. So the "we're already doing it" syndrome is rampant in this work. I mean, it's just it's everywhere. People think they're doing it, and they aren't, and sometimes they are actually. So one lesson that we've had is there's a couple places where you actually kind of are. we didn't expect that. This becomes as much about the politics as it does about the process. You know, I think when funding is involved, that gives you a level of dialogue that's different than it's just if you're trying to get them to the table. And I think the data ends up being the translator, right? Is you come back and you say, well, if you've got it, how come the number isn't moving, right? That is, I mean, the data is universally what makes people move in this. Is we had data from San Francisco that just showed how many kids were dropping out, how many kids weren't enrolling, how many kids were showing up needing remediation. And you could not run away from that. Houston has a great, I don't think I can find it fast enough, slide of their leaky pipeline of where all the kids are dropping out, and then they mapped it against what the average wages are for people who've dropped out at each of those. Super, super powerful. And the other thing that we typically say, and a message that resonates with school districts is, you can't do this alone. Because it isn't just about what's happening in the classroom. It is about what's happening out of school and with their parent engagement and the like. And in Cincinnati, a real turning point was when, you know, we talk about these report cards all the time. Well, in education, one, almost no city ends up calling it a report card. Educators hate having report cards about themselves. It's the funniest thing. It's an indicator report, it's a temperature taking, it's a roadmap, it's anything but a report card. Because K-12 in particular is used to having data come out that tells them they're terrible, right? And that's what the data is about. In Cincinnati, when they finally got it together to say, when the third grade reading number comes out, we're going to stand together. And the enrichment provider is going to stand with the parent engagement, you know, advocacy group is going to stand with the superintendent and say, we are working on this number, and it's not just their fault. It changed everything. And that's, when I talk to superintendents, that is, they get that they can't do it alone, but they don't like that you're going to come in and do another report card. And so then they get that, well, we'll just do it ourselves, thank you so much. So if you can get them, again, to think about the collective nature of collective impact, it usually does end up resonating, but it can be a tough conversation.
Really good idea.
Just a question on like concrete next steps and how cities that have come to you or you know, people that have come to you and said, well, I'm interested in doing it in my geography. I mean, I think step one is this kind of shared community vision and kind of, you know, generating that. And I mean, so, you know, what we're thinking about is, you know, there's the key questions to answer. I mean, you know, what, right? Is it education? Is it cradle to career, right? How is it kind of the Strive model?
Yeah.
Where we've talked a lot about, you know, and then also, you know, who. I mean, going back to some earlier comments you made of the kind of the key stakeholder groups at the table. I mean, we have the education group, we have the business groups, the philanthropy, the nonprofit groups. How have you seen, and who has done kind of these feasibility studies to begin to generate the data and the momentum in the community?
So typically, I just threw up our site level theory of change, kind of the evolution of a site, where you're not yet engaged deeply in the data when you start. You know, it's really about how do you get the executive leadership together. A criticism of Strive is that we are top down, but I think without the authorizing body, it is very, very, very hard to do this work. And it quickly then goes down into the doers, often, as people say. But I think your first level of feasibility is getting the top level leadership engaged and agreeing to do this work. And it is a huge role that funders and business leaders can play in catalyzing this. And then, you know, the other thing we would say is we don't even do business plans with our sites. And coming from Bridgespan, like, that's kind of hard for me to say out loud, right? That's all what we did. But we just say start with what you have. This is a continuous improvement process. So rather than you know, going nuts trying to get the perfect data. I mean, Cincinnati still has holes on its report card, and trying to do, you know, kind of get there. It's start with what you have, and that's both about data, but also about partners. So you may not have the whole cradle to career continuum ready to go, but if you have the third grade reading people fired up, then just start there. These things kind of happen in parallel, and pieces get built over time. So I think that's definitely part of it. The data conversation is interesting when it's so core to what we do, and it's also the one that can derail you the fastest, because people will argue, especially people who are fearful. They will argue that the data isn't right. That this indicator is just it's terrible. It just doesn't capture the teaching to the test, or high school graduation rates. I mean, who knows how to calculate those,
Yes.
right? And the head researcher at Cincinnati said, all of that is true, and people always say you can lie with the data, but it's a heck of a lot easier to lie without it. And so to just we encourage people to move, because this will get into analysis paralysis otherwise. So take the data you have. So if you can get, the leadership rallied, that's, the first step. If you can identify a couple of those areas you want to start moving in first, start with the data you have. It was extremely powerful in Cincinnati that they just got the college access providers to map who was serving whom. And that led to an immediate lift in what happened. And in San Francisco, same thing. The data immediately took us to this registration priority issue. But then you're not done, right? And what it allowed then in Cincinnati, the only data they had was from one organization of the 8. But then they built more data over time. The business community, part of the role you can play is helping people understand how to collect better, more valid data. And then the next year they could ask a much more sophisticated question of the data, and that led to the next set of actions. In San Francisco, the immediate data was changed to registration priority. Then we saw subgroups taking it up at different levels, and that led to an outreach conversation in the year never done. So we, I think in terms of where you start, it's getting your leadership table together, gathering what data you have, picking an outcome or outcomes to start with, and moving. Because the best thing that will get momentum for any of these efforts is when one high school goes from, hardly anyone getting in, a 40% bump in education. We had a huge bump in San Francisco when the registration priority was changed. And that bought us so much credibility that we could have professors talking to high school about pedagogy and curriculum and what was happening in the classroom. And that'll take another couple of years for them to finish that conversation. But it bought us the momentum. So that's the other thing that I would say with folks is early action and these early wins and usually people know what they are. But finding the data and finding the willing movers will get the flywheel spinning. Yes.
I'm curious about the Six Sigma model. Do you have a slide on that, or over here?
Do I have a slide? I do. Oh no, it is far away because I have all of these slides. I love this slide and no one else on my team likes it. So you won't see anyone else from my team use it. but the who, what, why of collaborative action. So Six Sigma is it's a process that GE developed. It's a manufacturing process to figure out if you're familiar with sort of the bell curve. You have the normal in the middle, and then the way they measure how far out from the normal is in sigmas. And they were trying to build a manufacturing process that was producing quality such that you're at the 6 sigma out on defect rates. So that's just what's on your defect rate. So if you're making refrigerators, how many refrigerators don't work? Yeah. This will get everyone in your business community excited and all of your nonprofits to run screaming. Because we've gotten the what is a sigma and what are you doing and what is it doing to our kids? We've definitely gotten that. So this is our attempt at a slightly friendlier language on it. But the actual Six Sigma process is you start by defining the problem. So this is selecting your priority outcomes and problem statements. And then you measure where you are. And so part of that is in the scoping of the work and of the networks. You're setting some of these network level measures and targets. You analyze. So Six Sigma is DMAIC. Define, measure, analyze, improve, and continuously improve. So then you analyze what's working and what's not. The reason, so here in the purple, which you can't read, is identifying some of these gaps, bright spots, and barriers kind of at the service level. This was the shift your resources and really try to drive to early action. So the arrow that goes down is then you say, well, what's the plan for moving the resource from the one high school that had 6 to the high school that doesn't? You actually have to say, how are we going to get that done? Who's moving, which of the 6, blah, blah, blah. To drive to early action, which will kind of lead to another question. The continuously improve is the loop back that says, all right, well, we got that done. Did it work? Did it not work? Who did it help? Who didn't it help? What's the next question we're going to ask? So the continuously improve is the loop at the bottom. What we usually find is that the early actions are going to be some of these high level, there are services here, there are not services here. There's this clear, registration priority or policy barrier in the way, and we're going to move it. And then you'll get one left, and then you're going to have to come back and ask the questions. The last arrow is analyzing kind of at the deeper level. So that's then they said it's these 5 services within college access that matter. To do that, you usually have to have student level data. So then the data on the bottom, right there. So what evidence base are you using to drive these conversations? Usually you're starting with publicly available high level data at the beginning. What is the 3rd grade reading number? These are all statistics that are fairly regularly published. That can get you through picking which outcome you're going to work on, setting some targets about how far we're going to move it and the like. Usually then you're asking your partners to bring we call this service unit, it's program level data, right? But we say service unit because it could be the school, it could be the nonprofit. But this is not attached to the fact that it's Kimberly right now, it's just who's doing what where, and how do we understand whether there's some changes that can be made based on that. The student level data over here is when we now know that Kimberly got tutoring and an enrichment program, and Lance only got tutoring, and Lance didn't come as often as Kimberly. And so maybe what we need to do is pair up the enrichment with the tutoring, because that gets the kid to come and be engaged, but get the content that they needed. And usually you are building to that level data over time. There's a couple of ways you can get there. We, in San Francisco, worked with Stanford as our research partner. Research institutions are allowed to match individual student level data if they're an accredited research institution, which shockingly Stanford is. So we had them as a partner. In Cincinnati, they actually built it into the school's data system, because the school as the primary actor can have the data. And we're working on actually taking that data system and making it available to other communities. We're not quite there yet. We're actually talking to a big data partner about how we can have more of that happen. But a lot of people think that they have to go there first or wait until the data is matched, and then there's the FERPA and the HIPAA and the, all the, and we worked through a lot of that. But that's why we also sort of created this loop that kicks out sooner. It's like there are early actions that can happen. And we ended up seeing a lot of people spinning trying to get through to the final level data. And you do want to get there. And then kind of who does the work is, the partnership table is your authorizing body. They have to agree that you're going to do this work. But then they hand it off either to a planning team. So sometimes we do see communities say, let's get like 5 people together to do the fish first, and then we know who to even call. We set some of the scope. Sometimes though you just immediately start the network. But then it's the networks and these networks in Cincinnati have been running for 6 years. And just kind of continuing. And it becomes that positive flywheel, because everybody's in this because they're passionate about helping kids, right? And when all of a sudden they can say, I never knew that I was missing one of the 5 things and that my kids could do better if I paired up with somebody who did it. The other interesting thing that happened with the school districts in Cincinnati, back to the school district conversation, is they did a quid pro quo with the networks. Is they basically said, we want everyone who's going to come to our school and try to offer services at the school to have a conversation with us about how you're helping move one of the academic indicators that we have to move. If it's 3rd grade reading and you are doing mentoring, we need to talk about how the mentoring is helping to move the 3rd grade reading. And you can be moving many other things. I mean, there's lots of other things that get tracked and understood and are important. But let's have that conversation. In exchange, you're going to know whether your kids are improving their 3rd grade reading. And
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah.
I was going to say we have time for one more quick question.
Okay, but anyway, but that was huge to get to the student level data. So there was an agreement that they could understand. There was a mutual benefit here that got to this finish line, but they certainly did not start there. Who gets the last question?
And then we'll move on to next step.
You had a slide on backbone organizations, and the first one said neutral, and then you moved off of it. Do you mind just throwing that up before you have to discuss it? I just wanted to see what else we
thank you so much for being here this evening. I just wanted to talk about a few quick next steps. One is going to be for SV2 Partners, and then one will be for guests. But I know you've all, if you feel like I do, we've been taking a drink from a fire hose right now. There's an awful lot to process. So we want you to go home and noodle on that a little bit. But an immediate next step is that we're going to be sending out to the SV2 Partners a Survey Monkey that will be a follow-up to this particular presentation. And it'll ask you not only to comment on the presentation, but also to think about what your involvement will be. As you know, collective impact and this whole conversation started out in the education grant round with some people saying, hey, we need more information about this. Let's bring in Strive. Let's hear from the horse's mouth all the good things, not that you're a horse, but hear all the good things that they're doing since they are clearly leading the way. And then it sort of moved to an R&D idea for the bigger SV2 audience. So we're looking right now at where that's going, and that all depends on you and your feedback. So if you could do that, the survey will be about 3 to 5 minutes to take. And if you could get that back to me really soon, then the sooner we move on it, the sooner we can get information back to the partnership. And then also for guests, if you're interested in continuing this conversation with us on some level, can you let us know at SV2? My email address is lisa@sv2.org, and we'll gather that information and keep you in the loop with whatever the loop looks like for us. So, are there any questions about that? Yeah, Phil.
Well, I'm wondering, with your experience, do you have any thoughts on how an organization like SV2 might best, engage in this model?
Yeah, and when I had a chance to have coffee with Lance, we talked about that, and I think he framed it well at the beginning, and I'll reframe it in my language. I think there's a sort of 4 roles that I could imagine that you could play. The first is the catalyst. The credibility of you all as an organization and as individuals is huge, and trying to get that table together. You are often the right people to be asking people to the table. So I would say that's an important role in this, is to get a community going. In some cases, it may make sense that you all could be a backbone. You could be the sort of lead anchor entity for an entire partnership, and I think that was the Seattle example. I think the other piece is to maybe take on what we call the lead convener role for one of the networks. So when a network gets going, it is really, really helpful to have someone who is sort of bringing it together, helping it move forward, and that was the role that the SVP took in Portland, was to be the sort of catalytic lead, not just the catalyst, because to me that's getting the conversation going and bringing the people together, but they're actually the anchor of the early childhood network. So you could anchor the whole thing, you could anchor one of the networks. And then I think in terms of funding, we didn't really get much into the lift slides, but you do have them. I think that one of the most important things is to think about how to fund differently in support of this. And some of it is the funding around some of the capacity building and the tools that are needed. But the other thing is, as a coalition of folks who are doing funding, how do you align around this to encourage more of it to happen? So if a network has set 5 measures that they're going, make those the 5 measures in your grants. Coordinating the funders is really, really, each individual sector amongst the 5. So coordinating across the 5 is really hard. Coordinating within any of the individual ones is actually sometimes even harder, because the history is longer, the rigidity is stronger, the trust is more complicated. And I think as funders, modeling it to say that we will think differently about how we fund, sends a huge message out. And it can be a combination of all of those, but those would be the ones that I think of. Lance, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think those are exactly how I was personally thinking about it, as the catalyst role, as a potential backbone for the whole thing, or a subsegment of it. I do think the mindset change is really important. So I just want to go back to something Kimberly emphasized. I mean, it's so much about showing momentum and early wins, and just generating that feeling of momentum, because it's a long-term game and it's a decade-plus game, but just generating momentum is so critical and important.
The thing that I'll leave you with is that my favorite quote that I'm saying everywhere I go now. It's actually a Henry Ford quote that my friends in Treasure Valley told me. And I got to use it in Detroit, which was awesome. But coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is success. And that is the evolution of this work. It really, coming together is the easiest part. Everyone wants kids to have good outcomes from cradle to career, or any other, I mean, this does work in any other sector, we just only do the education side. Keeping together, what's funny is when I first heard it, I thought the quote was keeping together is a process, because that's what it's going to feel like. That's the tough one, actually, because the flywheel, once you get the early wins, then it becomes self-sustaining, because then you really are at the working together level. It's the middle one that I think is the tough one, and it is a process, but honoring the fact that it is also progress is important in sustaining the work.
Well, thank you again, and wonderful.